Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar hosted by Carbon Gap. We are very excited to have this event to launch the final report on what we call the CARE calculator. We'll explain what it is about. Maybe we will take another 1 or 2 minutes to let people in, and then we'll start with a presentation, and we'll also let you know about the agenda for today. Okay, in the interest of time, let's get started. People will still be able to join as we introduce a little bit the agenda. So as I was saying, welcome to this webinar. Today we are launching the final report on the CARE calculator. This is a new tool that Carbon Gap is publishing. It stands for the Coordinating Allocation of the Removal Effort. So the program is that we will first have an introduction to the reasons and the motivation for Carbon Gap to work and publish this tool today. My colleague Alex will also introduce how the tool works and what are the learnings that we can draw from the tool. Then we will introduce our two panelists who joined us today for a discussion then on broadly speaking, how do we bridge the CDR gap? We'll come to that later. And also, what are the implications of the different learnings that we have drawn from the CARE calculator? Towards the end of the webinar, you will have a chance to ask questions. By the way, throughout the webinar, I think you can submit your questions in the Q&A module so that we can take them towards the end of the webinar. So without further ado, let's move to the next slide. Thank you. So let's start with the motivations of this work and what we are trying to achieve with this tool. So a lot of this work starts from the work that have been done and published, on the characterization of what is called the CDR gap. So that is the lack or the gap between what needs to be done or needs to happen in terms of CDR to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement and following the different IPCC pathways that would take us to meet these objectives. And what is actually planned by the major economies, at least. So in the paper published in 2022, led by William, who is with us today, there is a characterization of this CDR gap that evidences the fact that major economies are not yet planning for sufficient CDR to allow their climate strategies to actually meet the objective of the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So part of this, of the reasons for this lack of ambition or lack of planning, one could be called the net zero myopia, and it's this problem at the core of the Paris Agreement, where we have a temperature objective, but then the translation of that agreement has mostly been in adopting net zero goals by a certain date. But that slightly disregards a very important metric or parameter, which is the carbon budget or the remaining carbon budget to hold the temperature objective. This remaining carbon budget have different sizes depending on the objective that we adopt. And they are also evolving very fast. Recent papers have evidenced that. So on that regard, the work that has been conducted by the Finnish panel on climate change in 2019 in particular was very inspiring as well for us for this work. Essentially, they rebooted a little bit the way the countries set their climate targets, centering all the reflection around the remaining carbon budget and how much Finland can use. And that has translated into much more ambitious climate targets that the country has now adopted. Next slide, please. Another problem is that indeed at the global level, depending, across the different pathways to net zero and to meeting the Paris Agreement, the CDR needs have been quantified, and depending the trajectories, also the rapidity or the speed at which we can decarbonize, it is estimated that between 5 and 9 gigatons CO2 per year should be removed by 2050. But the problem is that these targets are kind of no one's targets because it hasn't been articulated who is responsible for deploying these quite significant volumes of CDR. Next slide, please. Then another element of context is the fact that with the emission that are still growing and the fact that we are exhausting the remaining carbon budget, we are progressively and quite fast reaching the point where we might enter overshoot, at least for the 1.5 degrees objective. And that changes a little bit the way countries should be looking at CDR, because beyond the polluter pays principle and the fact that every country should be able to neutralize at least their residual emissions to reach net zero, there is then an accumulated amount of greenhouse gases and CO2 in this case that will need to be managed collectively if we intend to then go back and remediate to the extent we can the overshoot. So that asks a different question also for the CDR planning and for countries. Next point, please. Finally, another element of context is the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, which is at the core of how the Paris Agreement works. So that means that regardless the approach that countries have today in terms of their CDR planning, because at the end of the day, this is a collective effort that needs to address a collective amount of carbon that we can still emit. There will be negotiations at the international level, and they will most probably be guided by this principle, which then again ask the question, how do you allocate the removal efforts? Final slide, please. So with this context in mind, just to articulate the main objectives of this work, the first one is to make the CDR gap more visible, in particular to decision makers and national decision makers, so that they are very much aware of the fact that more effort will be needed. Then the second objective is to explore how this effort on deploying CDR can be allocated. And again, the tool allows us to explore different ways. And another one is to try to break a little bit also the glass ceiling, we could call it, in CDR planning that exists today, in that most countries for now are only looking at the objective of neutralizing their residual emissions, but not beyond, except certain countries, like we can mention potentially the group of negative emitters. And then finally, the point of this tool is very much to inform the planning for CDR at national and international level. So with that, I will pass it to Alex for an introduction to the tool and how it works.
Thank you a lot. Yes, so now I'll take you through a demonstration of how the care calculator works. And this is going to be a little bit interactive. So please, if you could help us by participating with the Zoom poll. And this will pop up as we go through the demonstration, because we're going to ask you to vote on what options we should select when using the care calculator. So I'll go to the tool now. And with the calculator, we're exploring how much CDR the EU should be deploying in the future. And so this start page has some useful context for this question and explains that with this calculator, we're simulating the debate around CDR efforts on two levels. So firstly, at the international level. So this is where the EU is acting as a single entity on the global stage, and we're defining what their total EU contribution should be. And then secondly, at the EU level, where there are internal discussions to explore how much each member state should contribute. And with the calculator, we're looking at three main questions. So what type of climate future are we signing up for? And for this, we have the context of the different climate pathways and how much CDR is needed for each of those pathways. Secondly, which countries should be participating in these efforts? Should all countries be participating, or should just a smaller selection of more developed countries be participating, for example? And then finally, how should we distribute these efforts? How should this be allocated globally and also to the member states? And what criteria are important to consider for that conversation? So let's get started. So this page is about defining the global CDR need within the context of the possible climate pathways that are aligned with the Paris Agreement. So on the left, this figure shows summary data for climate model scenarios that are modeled for the C1, C2, and C3 pathways. And you can see these pathways have a different level and timing of net emissions reductions shown on the top, and also how they deploy CDR. shown on the bottom here. And throughout the care calculator, if you ever want more information on the data which is used, you can use these side panels. So the first poll is going to pop up, and that is because we're looking at step 1. And we're going to ask you to select what is the target year that you want to look at. So this is just the year that you would like to see how much CDR the EU should be doing. And also up there is step 2, and that is to select the global CDR need. So in the calculator, you have this range, and you can use this sliding bar. But for the sake of the demonstration, we've just given you 3 options: C1, C2, C3. So select which level of ambition you want to look at, and we will take this median value, which is the solid lines here. So I think we've given people a good amount of time to vote on that. So now I can see, oh, we're kind of split. Let's see. I see 20, 30, 40, and 50 all quite even. I'm gonna go with 20, 40 just to pick the middle one. And then for the global CDR need, people are interested in C1. So this is 7.1 gigatons of CO2 in the year 2040. So thanks everyone for voting. I will continue to the next page. And so with this page, we're simulating the international debate. So how should we allocate this global CDR effort that we just selected amongst countries worldwide? And then we'll end up with what the EU's contribution should be. So first, it's time for another poll. We will select which countries we think should participate in these efforts. So the options are all countries, Annex 1, high income, or upper middle and high income. So please select what you think, who should be responsible for CDR. And then in step 2, we are looking at different criteria for allocating these efforts. And there's 3 options we can consider here, and they have different data variants. So polluter pays. Should we consider those countries that have emitted more in the past? Should they be required to deliver more CDR? Should we look at countries' ability to pay? So those countries that are more financially capable, should they have a greater responsibility to deploying CDR? Or do we take a more egalitarian approach and say every individual has equal responsibility to CDR, and therefore just based on population size? So with the care calculator, you can also create these kind of hybrid combinations. So you don't need to select all criteria. You can exclude criteria. And then these sliding bars can be used to weight the importance of these different criteria that you have selected. So I'll give people maybe a little bit more time to vote while I explain maybe the data under ability to pay, because it's a little bit less intuitive. So GNI here is gross national income, and that is the total wealth of a country. And then you also have gross national income per capita. So that is the average wealth of an individual living in a particular country. Both of these kind of have limitations if we think of applying them to who should be delivering CDR. So gross national income, for example, you can think Poland has a large GNI within Europe, but maybe not the largest GNI per capita. So should they still be considered to deliver CDR? I don't know. Or if we look at just GNI per capita, a country like Luxembourg, for example, might have high responsibility, even though their overall wealth is relatively lower. So that's why there's this third category of GNI scaled by per capita GNI, which tries to balance both of those. Okay, so I think I've talked for long enough, and hopefully people had a chance to vote. Let's see what they came up with. So high income countries, people have selected that. Okay, doesn't need to be switched. For polluter pays, people are also most interested in from 1850. And GNI per capita has the highest. That's very interesting. So we'll switch that. And equality, average population. Perfect. Okay. And so now let's weight it. Let's see. Oh, and I should have mentioned with the polls for Zoom, they only have a scale of 1 to 10. And so this is just equated to 1 to 100 when we are looking at these sliding bars here. So I think we have a tie between 5 and 8. So I'm going to do 60 for polluter pays. Ability to pay is around 40. Okay, let's keep it at that. And actually, the highest for equality is at 0. So even though we have it listed here, it's going to be not included in our model. So we end up with a EU CDR contribution of 2.49 gigatons per year, so quite high already in 2040. So let's continue. So now with this page, we are simulating the discussion between EU member states to determine how much each of them should be contributing to the EU's total. So maybe at this level, other factors are more or less important. So that's why there's these kind of two levels, and we're gonna vote again. So let's pull up the poll. And with this EU discussions, there's also an additional criteria that you can consider, and that's biophysical capacity. And this is essentially countries' natural ability to remove and store carbon domestically. And there's two different data sets here. They're from different publications and include slightly different methods. So the first looks at the removal potential from reforestation, BECCS, and DACs. And the second looks at the climate mitigation potential from cost-effective land-based measures. So this is things like ecologic or ecosystem management or soil carbon sequestration. So the implication here is that those countries with higher biophysical capacity have a responsibility to harness that ability. So I'll give you a second to vote. And again, you can make these hybrid models. Okay, I think we can move on and see what people voted. Okay, so cumulative emissions again is high. Again, GNI per capita. Equality from 1990. And people do want to include data set 1, okay? And for weighting, we have, oh, we didn't quite get to the weighting, but I will make maybe an equal. Yeah, thank you very much. Ability to pay is also 50. Equality. We're going quite evenly distributed here. Yes, 50, 50, 50. Okay. So everything equally weighted. Excuse me. So with this configuration, we can see that Germany is required to give the most CDR, and their contribution is around 4 gigatons per year. They're followed by France, Spain, Italy, and Poland. Excuse me.
I think Alex meant 0.4 gigatons, which is 400 megatons.
0.4, sorry. Exactly. Thank you. Okay, so this final page just shows you your results, but within the context of some other relevant information. So the estimated CER contribution is shown alongside, for example, the LULUCF target for 2030, and also proposed removal targets for 2040. For the member states, you can see some other data sets. For example, you can compare these with countries' predicted residual emissions. So this is what countries think their level of residual emissions will be in the future. And you can see not all countries have reported these. And the configuration that we've chosen shows much higher volumes of removals are needed. You can also compare this with results from a least cost model, sorry, which looks at how Europe can reach net zero in 2050, but in isolation, so Europe on its own. And you can also directly compare this to biophysical capacity. So this might be interesting in terms of understanding if the amount of CDR countries should be responsible for, if they actually have the natural capacity to deliver those removals. So that was how the tool worked. Let's go back to the presentation. So not only did we create this tool, we also analyzed the results from the care calculator and also looked at which of these choices was maybe more important or less important. And so I'll take you through 4 key findings if we have the time. So before I do that, it's helpful to look at these 3 illustrative scenarios. And we're not advocating for one scenario over another with a care calculator. This is just a way to help us digest this information. So the first one is the global participation equality scenario. With this scenario, all countries participate and their participation is based at the global level and member state level completely on their population size. So this requires maximum collaboration and also results in a minimum ambition for the EU. So we can think of this being slightly unrealistic in terms of other arguments are probably going to be important for these negotiations. Our other 2 scenarios have a more limited group of countries, so upper middle and high income only. And this balanced equity version equally balances these 3 criteria at the global and member state level. So it's considering historical and financial responsibility. The final scenario, upper income capability, again, a more limited group of countries. And this is completely based on countries' ability to pay, and also at the member state level considers their biophysical capacity. So we're just looking at who is financially and naturally capable. So finding number 1 is that the estimated CDR contributions almost always exceeded the national and EU-wide plans. So this figure shows the results from these illustrative scenarios compared to the 2030 LULUCF target and the proposed targets for 2040. And you can see that in any reasonable scenario or any scenario that's not just based on population size, these volumes are much, much higher than what is here for the EU-wide targets. And the same comparison was true when we looked at what was happening in the member states. So comparing the member states' results with their CDR planning. The only exception was Finland, who appears to be a bit more on track with their target setting. But the others, definitely, they were missing the mark. For example, Germany is planning for 35 million tons in 2050 of removals, but their need could actually be double that or higher according to our scenarios. And the second finding, which plays into this, is that collaboration is really key. So if all countries participate, the EU's contribution that is required from them is much smaller. But if only, for example, Annex 1 countries participate, then the EU's share increases really dramatically. Finding number 3. So isolated national and EU planning for net zero goals won't be enough for reaching Paris Agreement goals. So if you remember with the final page of the care calculator, we compared our data to some other data sources which showed what is the ambition currently in member states, or what could be the ambition. For example, these teal bars are the residual emissions. So if countries plan to set their CDR targets based on what their predicted residual emissions will be, we can see that these are much lower than what is estimated by the care calculator. So they're not going to be high enough to contribute to these global goals. And we found that the final point, many of these countries, or a handful of these countries, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and Poland, for example, they consistently appear as needing to contribute the most to these efforts. So regardless of the scenario or regardless of the configuration of the tool. But we can see that there's still a lot to be done politically and operationally before these countries are really able to deliver at scale. So from this, we came up with several recommendations for the EU. Maybe for the sake of time, I will not go through them so much in detail because these are also available in our report that comes out. But essentially to incentivize countries to set explicit targets, and that this should be done using the NDCs, to establish a formal process to review these targets, to secure ambitious CDR targets from these key countries that we saw were continuously appearing in the top, to create demand mechanisms, for example, using the CRCF, and to really promote international CDR cooperation. So overall, we were seeing that currently the ambition is too low to meet these goals, and the EU needs to ensure transparency and incentivize action. So that is all from me. I think now we are headed to panel.
Thank you. I'll rescue you so you can have some water. Thank you very much for this introduction. Indeed, an invitation for everyone to check the report that we're launching today, but also the tool itself. It is published on the website, and there is a shorter version of the report as well available. So now, time to welcome our panelists. It's my pleasure to welcome Sophia Gezi from WWF, Policy Officer at WWF. Sophia has led the publication of a policy paper on CDR, and also William Lamb, Senior Researcher at the Potsdam Institute and author of the paper on the CDR gap. So welcome to the two of you. Now you have the time to introduce yourself, and also we gave you some homework to play with the tool and to come up with a scenario that you now have an opportunity to present. So maybe, Sophia, if you want to take it away first.
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me and for creating this very interesting tool. I was very excited to get to play with it. Yeah, I think as a way of introduction, you said it all. I'm Sophia. I work for WWF, the European Policy Office, so based in Brussels, and I lead on climate and land use policies for the European Office, which means indeed the CDR policies as well. Maybe as a way of introduction, I would also say that the answer that here I was asked to give an overview of what would be for WWF let's say the best scenario are of course very tentative. While you were explaining, I realized some things maybe I should have done differently, but it's interesting to have a discussion on this, and I'm very happy to give it a go if I can start. All right. Sorry, I will zoom a little bit because otherwise I don't see. Okay, so the way that we've decided to take it forward was to select all countries. And the reason why is that when we're talking about CDR, as WWF, we put a lot of emphasis on nature-based CDR, and we wanted to make sure that also countries that are already maybe net negative, they don't necessarily disregard their nature sinks, but maybe they are indeed incentivized to continue their protection. That doesn't mean that they will have the majority of the burden, of course, because there are those other principles that the team at Carbon Gap has already explained and presented in this webinar, and therefore I would expect that then those countries actually bear very, very little obligations. In terms of weighting, you can see on the top left side of this slide that I selected 40 for polluter pay, 40 for ability to pay, and 20 for equality. Again, then maybe a misunderstanding on my side. I thought the total should have gone to 100. That's why I also selected those. But ideally, the point for me was to really create some sort of balance where all of these principles are taken into account. But of course, we have a little bit more input on polluter pay and ability to pay. So what is the result of this? I, of course, wanted to take into account the biophysical capacity for Europe. As WWF, as I already said, we put a lot of emphasis on nature-based solutions. So the best data set for me to consider in this exercise was data set 2, because it takes into account conservation and restoration activities that, of course, are very, very important. And here the result was that the global need would be 10 gigaton of CO2 or carbon removals. And for Europe, it would represent around 16%, if I remember correctly, because I don't necessarily see it in the slide. Yes, I see you nodding. Great. I weighted more or less the same. I weighted the same principle, let's say, in a very similar way as I did for the global level. So I have, I think, 30, 20, 20, and 30. So more or less, I also tried to keep it relatively balanced. But of course, the biophysical capacity is quite important. And as I said, for us, it's very important to put a focus on nature-based because they are cheaper, they are the quickest, they are effective, they solve the biodiversity crisis as well. So they have this dual role. And of course, they can help with climate adaptation and ecosystem restoration. So if now we go to the most interesting part, I would say probably of today's discussion is this realistic, and to what extent the countries that have the biggest obligation in Europe can actually deliver on those targets in terms of their biophysical capacity. So if you look at Spotlight 2 on the bottom right corner, there you see the same countries that Carbon Gap has also underlined. So I think the result is pretty much always the same. You always have Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and Poland as the most, let's say, the one that have the biggest obligations. But if we look at data set 2, so the pink bar, you see that actually the global obligation supersedes the level of biophysical capacity available for those countries. While if you look at data set 2, which is the X, they have more biophysical capacity, and it would be ideally more easy. What does it mean? That my takeaway specifically would be that here we're of course talking about global needs, not European needs in a vacuum, let's say. So my key message would be to you that of course we need to do as much as possible under the nature side, so as much as possible for what is available in terms of biophysical capacity. And to bridge the gap, we must consider to what extent we should invest in Europe, for example, for DAX, taking into account the geological spare that is available, considering also the competition that will be for those geological storages, and also the opportunity maybe to invest abroad via international climate finance, again in nature-based solutions. So have this kind of vision where both things are considered. I think I will close it at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Very good presentation. William, do you want to take it off?
Yeah, thank you.
To
Also, thank you for the invitation to look at this. I think I like the tool, and I think it's important to raise the topic of fair contributions to a global CDR need. There's more and more discussion about this, at least in the academic literature. And I think these kind of things are important also to filter through into the discourse, the negotiations, and it's discussions at a sort of national policy level about what obligations countries actually do have. Obviously, it becomes more relevant if we plan to keep ambitious climate targets within reach. It's likely we will increasingly talk about that as the 1.5 degree carbon budget declines. So yeah, I mean, when I was thinking about this and working through the different options here, I decided to focus on 2050 with 1.5 degree targets. I think this time frame and these targets currently set the discourse around CDR needs. So 2050 obviously coincides with a lot of the net zero targets that we know, but also the scientific evidence coming from the IPCC that this is when we need to achieve global net zero in order to keep the Paris Agreement goals within reach. So I think this is good a place as any to think about those benchmarks of action. Obviously, working backwards from then, you can have a discussion about 2030 and what countries are doing in the very short term. And a little bit gets to the distinction of what types of CDR are relevant in those different timeframes. So right now, there's a lot of what we call conventional CDR, which is efforts like afforestation, reforestation, what Sophia said, nature-based solutions. You could think about options like peatland restoration, ecosystem restoration, forest management, and so forth. These were all relevant for that, and they can be implemented relatively quickly and in the short term. But if you want to go for durable geological storage-based methods like direct air capture, then obviously you need time to put those in place in order to actually have the technology ready to go in 20, 30, 40 years. Okay, so maybe 2050 target starts to become relevant for those other novel methods. So not just direct air capture, but also things like biochar or ocean alkalinization and other types of CDR methods that are currently discussed. Yeah, so I mean, for participating countries, I chose the upper middle and high income countries. I think one can make a good argument for selecting all countries, but also a focus just on high income or Annex 1 could be justified, for example, on the basis of historic responsibility. However, I think I sort of lean towards the notion that CDR deployments could be spread a little bit wider for a number of reasons. So I think, first of all, you don't want to put all of your eggs in one basket. I don't think it would be sensible for just a smaller group of nations to do this. So it's a sort of a risk management thing going on here. If more countries participate, there's less risk that some of them pull out, and that this has a major effect on the global direction of travel. I think it also allows for more diverse options and more like different global portfolios of CDR. So different countries might have different types of CDR that they could differently implement. And we should also recognize that there can also be like co-benefits of implementing certain types of CDR. I think this is exactly the argument that Sophia made, that actually forest restoration, ecosystem restoration, peatland rewetting, these kind of methods could be very, very beneficial for some countries on adaptation, but also for livelihoods. So yeah, so I would definitely view this as something that could be global in scope. On the equity criteria, I chose cumulative emissions since 1990. I think 1850 can also be justified. 1990, of course, is very clear because this is when the science and the policy was established. So we had the first IPCC report, we had the UNFCCC. No one can deny that at that point in time, we knew that climate change is a major issue. So I think when you think about cumulative historic emissions, that is a very clear cutoff date. You can go further back in time to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. This is very influential, for example, for the United Kingdom, for the United States. But actually, when I played with that, it didn't seem to change the results very much. And of course, that is due to a very large chunk of the remaining carbon budget actually being exhausted in the past 3 decades. So before 1990, not a lot of, I don't have the numbers in my head, but comparatively speaking, I think it doesn't matter so much. I chose GNI per capita and current population mainly for transparency because I think these are clear indicators that most people can understand and grasp. And to be honest, I wasn't really sure about the appropriate weighting of the indicators. Perhaps would have appreciated some guidance on this. I mean, I think I chose 40, 20, 20. Polluter pays sounds really good to me. So I put more on that and then equally balanced the others. But I wasn't entirely sure what would be the way to go here. Yeah. So looking at my results and the conclusion, I think it's clear that the EU has relatively low ambition. And I think you're right that we need to start to deliver this information in NDCs in a clear and transparent way as a starting point so that we can have a more concrete discourse. EU is one of the few parties in the G20 and globally that actually have clearly set even a LULUCF target. Most countries have not done that. And it's absolute minority that have even talked about more novel carbon dioxide removal methods in the coming decades. I think United Kingdom stands pretty much alone in that. So first step, transparency, and then we can have a discussion about ambition for sure. Comparing these results to domestic biophysical capacity is kind of interesting. This is also an active area of research that I'm trying to get involved in. There was recent work within one of our projects that looked into prudent geological storage potential globally. And that certainly raises concerns that there's actually, when you look at the numbers on geological carbon storage, that in areas that are available, safe, they're not in natural parks, they're not in the Arctic, they are not close to cities and human habitation. That all constrains our potential very drastically. So this is major concern. Also raises the question of whether countries with high responsibility but low biophysical capacity could be assisting others to deliver CDR, and what format that could take and how to do that in a not bad way. So I think, overall, this is a good step forward to have this tool. And a final comment, I suppose, is important to mention here is current CDR. So what are countries currently delivering? The EU has this LULUCF target of 310, but of course it does have current removals in its greenhouse gas inventory to the tune of about 200. But that situation is rapidly changing. So this land sink is declining rapidly in Europe right now. And so thinking about these results in the context of what's currently happening is very, very important. It looks like the EU will not make this target, even if has very low ambition according to the calculator. So that is another important thing to discuss.
Yeah, thank you very much, William, for the presentation. Thank you both for playing the game. Quick clarification maybe on the last point you were raising, William, and this is exactly the care calculator explore the allocation of the kind of responsibility to make CDR happen. Where there is a mismatch between biophysical capacity and responsibility, you would expect these countries indeed to go into cooperation mechanisms. So, and that go also to your earlier point that there's a lot of potential in nations, potentially in the global south, where the nations potentially don't bear a huge responsibility, but they do have a lot of potential. And that's where cooperation mechanisms like Article 6 or other mechanisms like that could be helpful if they are conducted well to operate that responsibility and allow these countries to make CDR happen, even if that involves a bit beyond their borders. Just in the interest of time, we'll continue with the conversation, and I'd like to ask a question first to you, William. How important or critical is it to bridge the CDR gap? Essentially, what happens if countries keep planning as they do today and we don't bridge that gap? Can you describe this in a nutshell to our audience?
Yeah, okay, so we can anticipate that we won't meet our climate targets globally. So we can anticipate that the Paris Agreement temperature goals will be breached. Of course, the emissions gap is actually the most decisive for this, right? So the CDR gap can contribute to reaching net zero and compensating some overshoot thereafter, but the extent to which we miss those temperature targets is actually mostly dependent on the amount of ambition, the amount of action that we achieve in reducing emissions. But the CDR gap is concerning. It's concerning because these things take time. Technology transitions take time. Solar PV boom didn't happen overnight, but it took decades to realize. So if we want to plan for getting those levels of CDR by 2050, we actually need to start now. And so that's what I would say.
Yeah, definitely. And actually worth mentioning that in the quantification that the tool provides, we rely on the IPCC scenarios, which means that already in this quantification of the CDR gap that we're using, there are significant emission cuts embedded. And the reality is also that some of these emission cuts are not even realized, which also question then the actual size of the CDR gap, which is potentially growing, which is not good. But, because again, as you pointed and as recent work has shown, we won't have limitless capacity for CDR. So the work on emission cuts is really, really important if we want this to work. Maybe next question for you, Sophia. So setting targets, CDR targets in particular, is a very difficult practice. We typically hear concerns about countries over-relying on CDR to meet their net zero goals and potentially causing what we call mitigation deterrence. But here with the tool, we see that there is also a risk for countries to underestimate how much CDR they have to deploy. So how do we square this? Do you have a view on that, on how do we square these two risks and to land in the good place?
Thanks. Difficult question, I must admit. I think, yeah, we see both sides, right? Like, I mean, the main problem when we see too over-reliance in policy talks on CDR is that the conversation tends to forget that we need to pressure forward on emission reductions. I mean, an example of this would be, for example, the ongoing debate on the inclusion of permanent CDR in the EU ETS. While the EU ETS actually has a potential to continue decarbonize, and permanent CDR might not need to be included at all, and we might want to scale it up in a second way. This is a real-time issue that might be realizing with the integration of permanent CDR in the UTS emission deterrence indeed. So that is one side of the thing. The other side is indeed that, as you said, and as we're seeing, there's not a lot of planning. In particular for the LULUCF, so the regulation that we have now for accounting land-based carbon dioxide removals. The ambition is there, although for NGOs and CSOs, it's already not enough, and we're not even reaching it. So there's also a mismatch between maybe in some CDRs, we already have a target, like for LULUCF, and we are not doing enough. Who's the fault of that? It's the political choices that we're making. We are seeing the sink, as William has also just said, declining its capacity to absorb CO2 of 30% in the last decade. And this is clearly linked to our harvesting practices, of course, including also natural disasters that are happening and increased effects of climate change. But there are very many scientific studies from the JRC, from the EA, linking directly to the way that we harvest our wood and how much we're harvesting, linking to the fact that then the sink is, of course, declining. So when we even have a target, sometimes it's not enough. It's an empty target if it's not followed through. For permanent removals, there is debate. There is not an EU strategy yet. I mean, there is the carbon management strategy, but it's not precise on what CDR, how CDR should look like in the future. There's already some talks happening on how to finance them and etc. So this is definitely a first step. But clearly it's not enough considering what we might need for the future. There's the need to look into it more, although some words of caution. I mean, most of this technology haven't been yet proven at scale. There is a significant trade-off. There is an even cost, and we have an opportunity to go for cheaper, quicker, and more reliable CDR. So the point of view of WWF is that we should start with those while we continue our research on the permanent removal side as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sophia. We still have time for another one or two questions to our panelists. Alex, do you want to go next?
Yes, I think my voice is working again. So my question is towards both of you, I think, and it's regarding coordination. So we saw with the calculator, it really showed us how important it is for countries to cooperate. So the more countries participating, the more realistic we can say the EU's target became. So have either of you kind of observed any consideration for this coordination, this type of coordination between countries when it comes to setting CDR targets? Are people using this approach? So, Sophia?
Hi. Yeah, I'm happy to start. For LULUCF, for example, this is already happening. Technically, at least it's enshrined in the law. So there is this chance of indeed trading between member states when they reach, for the member state that is reaching the 2030 target, they can actually trade with other member states that are a bit lower in their target to make sure that we reach the EU level target. However, this is also possible in 2025. However, we haven't seen that happening yet because we need to see when there is the accounting period closed and if there will be any credits in the system at all. So this has sparked a lot of questions on what will be the price of these credits and who's paying for that, for the lack of ambition. We could call it cost of inaction. So it's actually a very interesting point to look and ask our governments, have they been considering this? But the reality, looking at least the NECP's assessment from the Commission, is that only 4 member states, I think, that have been assessed by the Commission at least, are reaching or expected to be reaching their target. So I even wonder if there's going to be any credit in the system to be actually traded. And for permanent CDR, I don't think this consideration have been happening so much yet. Something has been discussed to a limited extent within the CCS directive framework. So the fact that technically member states are not required to coordinate among themselves, to the best of my knowledge, but there is some cross-border projects happening, for example, like the projects of common interest or the projects of mutual interest that are taking place for this geological storage space. But I would say it's still very, very limited, the cooperation there.
Thank you, Sophia. William, would you like to add to that? Otherwise, I think it's maybe time to move to questions from the audience.
No, I think Sophia answered perfectly.
Great. Shall we check what we have?
Yeah, so maybe one question I was keen to pick on is a question from Fabiola. She's asking that in this tool, the tool appears to be mostly demand-driven. The question being how much CDR we will need. So her question is a supply-driven approach to CDR? So how much we can actually do also considered, because of course these two need to talk to each other. So I think this is something that we're trying to reconcile, and studies exist at different levels, most often specific to a technology, to try to estimate the potential of a given CDR method on how much they can scale and how much they can deliver. So at Carbon Gap, what we're trying to do is to reconcile the two. So first of all, how much do we need to actually hit the temperature target? Because at the end of the day, that's the main objective. But then, of course, we also look at the supply side, in particular with the work we're doing on the carbon removal readiness assessment, or short name being country reports, where we zoom country by country and we try to generate a bottom-up assessment, conservative assessment on how far the country can go in deploying CDR, to do exactly that, to match the two and see, does that work? Which countries will have like excessive CDR capacity, which countries will have a deficit and will probably then engage into cooperation with other countries. So that's something we're also looking at. And I think this is still an evolving topic, because again, we're still missing data, granular data, I would say, in many countries to understand really how far we can go playing on the full scope, let's say, of the different CDR methods. And I think that also ties to another question in the chat from Alex, who is asking how can we make sure that countries from the global south are also included, those that have some capacity but potentially no responsibility, let's say, to deploy. And again, I think in that scenario, the expectation would be that the countries bearing the responsibility would engage both in deploying CDR domestically, but also filling the potential missing capacity by engaging in cooperation with those countries to procure sufficient CDR and hit the targets. Other questions in the chat?
I think they are mostly about the tool itself. Maybe we can also ask a question of our own to
Yeah.
the panelists. Yes.
Okay.
Let's see. Okay. So maybe a question for William. I think we've touched on it a little bit in previous ones, but of these main European countries that consistently appear on the top, so Germany, Italy, Poland, France, Spain, do we think that they are on track, or do we think they are seriously considering this issue, or is this something that is not really, yeah, that they're not fully prepared for?
Right, so I can speak very deeply on the current political situation. I mean, perhaps Sophia grasps better what's going on. I mean, the state we're in right now is the countries were supposed to deliver their 2035 targets back in February, but very few have actually even done this right now. So COP is going to bring these together, and they should be discussed at COP in November. But among the G20, the European Union has not delivered. And I understand that there's a big internal conflict around this. So inferring from that, I would say that we're not doing too well on this particular topic.
Should I jump in and complement?
Yes, of course. Go ahead, Sophia.
Yeah, just before jumping on this call, I went to look what is the ambition gap. Also, just looking at the NACPs of the main countries that are on the list. So Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. I didn't look into Poland, but I'm sure it's more or less the same. And they have a very, very big ambition gap. Germany has, for LULUCF, 6.6 megaton of CO2 removals. France has 13.4, Italy has 9.2, and Spain has 6.11 megaton of CO2 removal. So we're talking high numbers. And also what we hear from offices on the ground is that those are also just plans. So it doesn't mean that the gap will not even be bigger. Even just with the planning, we're doing very, very bad. So there needs to be a huge shift. And for permanent removals, actually, you guys at Carbon Gap have done most of the work with your policy tracker, where you went in to look at which countries are moving or not on permanent removals. And I think Germany, it's on the right track, but we don't really have anything concrete yet. And I think France, Italy, and Spain are very much lagging behind, especially Italy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sophia. Maybe I wanted to ask another question, potentially to you, William, first. One thing we haven't been able in the tool, at least in this version, is to include a breakdown between temporary removals and permanent removals. I think Sophie already floated that they might have different maturities, but they also potentially have different roles and efficiencies in addressing the residual emissions. So also because you worked on the CDR gap initially, how important is it in your opinion to close the CDR gap with specific shares of the different methods between temporary and permanent removals?
Yeah, so it's quite important. It's also important when we think about how countries are defining removals. So the status quo is that countries submit their inventories to the UNFCCC. This informs what the components of the LULUCF sector that are net negative are typically inferred as removals. So basically the forest remaining forest category in those NDC in those inventories. Now the problem with that is that there's more and more scientific evidence about the fact that those removals are not directly or not entirely directly human driven, but they are the result of what we call indirect anthropogenic effects. So CO2 is going up in the atmosphere. That increases the fertilization of vegetation. And you get quite a large chunk of removals just from that effect in standing forests. So not even forests that are counted as being produced through afforestation from previously degraded land or agricultural land. Now, from a scientific perspective, when you reach net zero, you don't have that increase in the atmospheric greenhouse gas concentration. That effect disappears. And the evidence we have right now is that it reverses. So if you account for those removals now, they disappear later, which means that actually a large chunk of the existing targets is not entirely relevant for filling the CDR gap. We tried to deal with this in our paper, and there's a whole series of now scientific articles, and it's a big discussion in the IPCC, so the International Panel on Climate Change, is just how to resolve this. And basically, one of the messages is these temporary, you can think of as sort of temporary removals, and they might be able to compensate for things like short-lived climate forcers, methane, nitrous oxide, but it's not a substitute for geological storage to reach net zero.
Sophia, do you want to add to that or not necessarily?
No, maybe just a call for Carbon Gap. Maybe if you develop further the tools, what would be also interesting to see is really the breakdown between the type of removals in terms of need. What exactly are we looking at? And I will leave it at that. That would be very interesting for us.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm afraid we are already at time. A shame because of course this is our discussion that we can keep going for a while, but it's time to wrap up. So I would like to thank our panelists very much for joining. Sophia and William, thank you very much. Also to all the participants who joined today for this discussion. The webinar will be is recorded and will be made available as well for you to be able to come back to it. And yeah, finally, please visit the tool on our website and read the report. Feel free to reach out to us for questions or also comments. We are also always very much interested in feedback. And yeah, we hope this was a useful conversation and to see you soon in another webinar. So thank you very much to you all and have a good rest of the day.